And today it's my honor and pleasure to introduce your speaker. And Dr. MJames is the Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics in ASU. And his presentation is a study of techniques for promoting ESOL students' transfer motivation. I give you Dr. James. Thank you.
Thanks, Olga. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Mark, and I'm very happy to be here. It was a pleasure driving in today, and the weather was nice. I hope you are enjoying yourselves here. If you're not local, I think you're lucky to live here if you're local, and if not, I hope you enjoyed the drive-in like I did today. So thank you, and that's the title of my presentation. I'm going to stick fairly closely to some notes that I've got here, just because I want to make sure that I don't go on too long. I'm also going to turn this on, so that hopefully I sound a little clearer. The mask, so it gets in the way a little bit, but does that sound okay at the back?
Good.
Great, okay, super. Okay, so let's get right to it. Let me change slides here. Great, okay. So the topic of this study is transfer motivation. More specifically, how ESOL teaching might influence students' motivation to transfer learning from the ESOL classroom to other situations outside the classroom. Let me start by providing a bit of background information on this topic. First, this study rests on the idea that a fundamental goal of ESOL education is students' transfer of learning to new situations. For example, in an English for Academic Purposes, or EAP course, there's an expectation that students will transfer what they learn in the EAP course to their academic work in other courses. If the students don't transfer learning from the EAP course to their other courses, the EAP course's value is questionable. The importance of transfer is especially obvious when English or any other language is being taught for a specific purpose, like EAP. But ultimately, transfer is a fundamental goal in any ESOL or second language education context. Now, one thing that's important to know about learning transfer is that it can happen in two main ways. First, transfer can happen automatically when one situation resembles another situation. For example, I learned to drive a car a long time ago, and I drive all the time, so I'm pretty good at driving cars. I've never driven a truck, but if I get behind the wheel of a truck for the first time, my ability to drive cars will transfer to this new situation because of all the similarities. Like there's a steering wheel, a gas pedal, a brake pedal, left and right turn indicators, and so on. So I won't have to think about it because transfer will be automatic. On the other hand, the second main way that transfer can happen is deliberately. And this doesn't depend on resemblances between situations. For example, when I'm driving that truck and I'm trying to navigate through a traffic jam, I might deliberately reflect on a video that I watched recently about how atoms and molecules move through space, and they avoid smashing into each other. And I try to do the same thing when I'm driving the truck. So there's no resemblance, there's no superficial resemblance between the situation in which I was watching the video on atoms and molecules and the situation in which I'm driving the truck through a traffic jam. But I'm able to transfer learning between these situations deliberately. So while both types of transfer, automatic and deliberate, are important, I'm going to focus the rest of this presentation on deliberate transfer. It's a worthwhile focus because deliberate transfer can occur over relatively large distances, because it doesn't rely on situations resembling each other. And that's valuable because in ESOL education, we don't always know what kinds of future situations our students are going to find themselves in when they leave our course. So preparing ESOL students to transfer learning deliberately is worthwhile. Now, since this kind of transfer is deliberate, it requires motivation. Without motivation, I won't make the effort to look for connections between situations and try to find ways to apply something that I've learned recently or previously. In other words, if I'm not motivated to transfer learning, deliberate transfer is unlikely. So if ESOL teaching aims to meet this fundamental goal of promoting students' learning transfer, it makes sense that ESOL teaching should aim to promote students' motivation to transfer learning. So with that background in mind, I developed a study to answer these three research questions. In an ESOL education context, 1, are students motivated to transfer learning? 2, does teaching involve teaching for transfer? And 3, is there a relationship between teaching for transfer and the student's motivation to transfer learning? So to answer these three research questions, I carried out a questionnaire survey study in fall 2020 with 287 students who were taking first-year EAP courses at a US university. These were 3-credit courses that the students were required to take. To give an idea of the content of those courses, students had to complete 3 major writing assignments, totaling 5,000 words, and the assignments involved various kinds of writing. For example, explaining a concept, proposing a solution to a problem, or arguing a position. On this slide, we get a closer look at the 287 students in terms of background information. You can see here that it was a diverse group in a variety of ways, and I'll leave the slide there for a few seconds so you can just browse. Okay. So those were the participants, and the data collection involved having them fill out a questionnaire. This was an online questionnaire that I created for this study, and it took about 10 to 15 minutes for the students to complete it. I won't go into detail here about the steps that I followed to create the questionnaire, but basically it involved piloting early drafts of the questionnaire with other groups of students and doing certain kinds of statistical analyses to check the validity and the reliability of the questionnaire. Those steps seem to work well, and if you have any questions about those details, feel free to bring them up after or email me. I'd be happy to talk about details by email as well. So let's take a look at the questionnaire. It had 44 multiple choice items, each of which was a statement followed by a 5-point Likert scale. And the scale was strongly agree, agree, not sure, disagree, strongly disagree. And the questionnaire was meant to measure the student's transfer motivation, 5 teaching for transfer techniques, and 2 other factors that can influence transfer motivation. And that's what we see here. So I'll give us some examples of these just so you can see what that looked like to the students who filled out the questionnaire. So first, for motivation to transfer, or transfer motivation, 8 of those 44 items measured this. For example, one of the items said, in my courses in the next few semesters, I will make an effort to use knowledge and skills from this semester's EAP course. That was one of the items. There were 7 others to measure motivation to transfer. And then, after motivation to transfer, there were these 5 teaching for transfer techniques. These are the practical teaching for transfer techniques that I was really interested in. Each of those had between 3 and 6 questionnaire items to measure it. The first teaching for transfer technique is creating contextual similarity. And this means the instructor makes the EAP course resemble situations outside the EAP course. For example, situations in students' other courses. Now that's important because it helps students to see connections between the EAP course and other contexts, and that helps with transfer. So an example for that teaching for transfer technique is this item the students were asked to read and respond to. This semester's EAP course materials, for example the textbook, are similar to materials in other courses. The second teaching for transfer technique is teaching general principles. This means that in contrast to teaching only superficial facts and routine procedures, the instructor teaches general principles. For example, general principles of English academic writing, like the importance of coherence. This is important because with general principles, it's easier for students to see connections to other contexts, especially if those contexts are different from the EAP course. And here's an example. This semester's EAP course materials, for example, the textbook, taught general principles of writing. Agree, disagree. The third and fourth teaching for transfer techniques are about providing ample practice for students in reading and in writing. This is pretty straightforward. It just means that the instructor gives students lots of practice. And that's important because with lots of practice, students' abilities can become more automatic. And this can help with transfer. An example of one of those items for reading said this. In this semester's EAP course, we looked at many examples of writing. In other words, we read many examples. And an example for the next one, which is also about ample practice, but it's about writing. The example said this. In this semester's EAP course, I had to write a lot for homework. And the fifth and last of the teaching for transfer techniques is providing variable practice. This means the instructor makes sure that the practice that students get is not always the same. And instead it involves variety, like different kinds of genres, different types of topics. This helps students to notice underlying patterns in what they're doing. And when students can notice those patterns, it should be easier to transfer to other contexts, especially if those contexts are different from the EAP course. An example questionnaire item for this says, in this semester's EAP course, the writing assignments all had a similar topic. So I assumed that if the students disagreed with this item, that meant that they had lots of variety, of variable practice in their course. And finally, besides those teaching for transfer techniques, there's two other factors that I wanted to look at. And these are, based on my reading in this area, these are factors that can influence transfer motivation. The first is the student's perceived competence. In other words, the student's sense of their own ability to write academic English. There were 4 items to measure this factor. For example, one item that says, in this semester's EAP course, my writing became better. And the second of those 2 factors, at the end here, is the student's expectations for and beliefs about transfer. For example, whether the students expected to have opportunities to transfer learning in their other courses, and whether the students expected that transfer would have a positive impact. There were 7 items to measure this, and an example is this item. If I use knowledge and skills from this semester's EAP course and other courses, I will get higher grades in those courses. So that was the questionnaire. And when the 287 students had completed it, I used the data to answer the research questions. So let's take a look at that now. So the first research question asked if these students were motivated to transfer learning. The numbers you see here are the totals for all of the items that focused on transfer motivation. And remember, there were 8 items on the questionnaire that measured transfer motivation. So these are the totals for those 8 items collapsed. If we look here at only the positive responses, on the right side of the table, we can see that 38.55% of the responses were strongly agree, and 47.73% were agree. So if we add those 2 together, we see that over 85% of the responses to these items were positive. So I think we can conclude that for this group of EAP students, it was common to be motivated to transfer learning. And on this slide is the second research question. Do these courses involve teaching for transfer? This table shows students' responses to the questionnaire items that dealt with the 5 teaching for transfer techniques. For example, the top row, is for the technique creating contextual similarity. And we can see that 6.56% of the responses about that technique were strongly agree, and 21.43% were agree. So if we add those two together, we can see that fewer than 30%, excuse me, fewer than 30% of the responses were positive about there being contextual similarity between the EAP course and other courses. Now, if we do the same with the other 4 techniques, we see that for teaching general principles, about 88% of the responses were positive. For providing ample reading practice, about 88% were positive. For providing ample writing practice, about 75% were positive. And for providing variable practice, about 38% were positive. So it looks like it's common for these courses to teach general principles and to provide ample reading and writing practice, but it's less common for these courses to provide variable practice, and in particular, to create contextual similarity. And on this slide is the third and final research question. Does teaching for transfer influence these students' motivation to transfer learning? To answer this question, I did a statistical test called a multiple regression analysis, and this looks at relationships between variables. In this case, I was looking to see if transfer motivation had relationships with the 5 teaching for transfer techniques and those 2 other factors. And what the results of the test showed is that transfer motivation did have significant relationships, but it was only with the other 2 factors, not, which are highlighted at the bottom here, not with the 5 teaching for transfer techniques. It didn't have relationships with any of those. No significant relationships with any of those. So that leads us to the following answer for this research question. Teaching for transfer did not influence these students' transfer motivation. However, the other factors, perceived competence, and in particular, transfer expectations and beliefs, did influence these students' transfer motivation. Now, after this slide, I've included a couple of slides with more details about that statistical test for anyone who wants to take a closer look later, but that's the gist of it. So we'll skip ahead to looking at the implications of this. So if you want to take your time after, you can take a look at a little bit more information about that regression analysis. So implications. The first point here is in relation to the answer to the first research question. The findings showed that transfer motivation was common in this group of students. And this is positive in that teachers in this ESOL context seem to have little to worry about regarding students' transfer motivation. But this study was done at only one point in time and in only this one ESOL context. So it's uncertain if these findings will be the same with future groups of students in this context or with students in other ESOL contexts. So with that in mind, it might be worthwhile for teachers in this and other ESOL contexts to monitor students' transfer motivation using a questionnaire like the one that was used in this study. It would be simple to use and would generate valuable information. And the second point here is in relation to the answer for the second research question. The findings showed that some teaching for transfer techniques, more specifically teaching general principles and providing ample practice, were commonly reflected in these courses. But other techniques, more specifically providing variable practice and creating contextual similarities, were much less common. Now this is positive in that the teaching that is happening in this ESOL context could be helping to promote students' learning transfer. However, there are more ways in which it could be done. So if teachers in this program were to investigate and find out that there is less learning transfer happening than what they would like to see, the findings here point to steps that they could take to try to address this problem. In other words, they could try to do more to provide variable practice and to create contextual similarities. And the third point here, third and final point, is that in relation to the answer to the third research question, the findings showed that the students' transfer motivation was significantly influenced by their expectations and beliefs and their perceptions of competence, but not by teaching for transfer techniques. Now, this is very interesting. Transfer over far distances is deliberate. So, motivation must play an important role. But it looks like teaching for transfer might not help with that. In an ESOL context like this, where transfer motivation is common, that might not be a concern. But in ESOL contexts where transfer motivation is less common, teachers may want to find ways to help students to develop transfer motivation. The findings for this third research question do also point in some useful directions here, because these students' transfer motivation was strongly influenced by the students' perceptions of competence and, in particular, by their expectations for and beliefs about transfer. So teachers who want to help students to develop transfer motivation may want to look for ways to help students to perceive themselves as competent and to develop transfer-conducive expectations and beliefs. In other words, it may be a good idea to expand the idea of teaching for transfer in those directions. And that's about it. So I'll go ahead and show you that there's, oh, no, I didn't include the references, I'm sorry. If you have any questions about any of the slides, any background research related to this, please feel free to email me anytime. And there's a QC code about this session there, so feel free to use that. And I think we have some time for some questions and answers.